I, James, collier, 41 years of age, married with 4 children. At work 1,200 feet below ground at the coal face of a Rhondda pit. A few yards along this 5-foot seam, his workmate Jim Hopkins, 31, married with 2 children. 2 colliers then, 2 of the 7,000-odd mine workers employed today in the Rhondda valleys. Even with the mechanical aid of pneumatic pick and belt conveyor, it's still hard graft. It's a dirty job. It's dark. It can be dangerous. To do the work needs skill and strength. To do it daily needs quick wits and a rough-tongued philosophy and a rude, ready humor, often as dry as the pit dust itself. As they work below, or as they tramp back a mile or so along the tunneled roadway to pit bottom at the end of shift, these men are the present heirs of an ancient order that's lasted for a century and a half. A democracy of work shared by generation after generation under the earth. This is their story and the story of Rhondda. And in its essentials, it's the story of all the valleys in the coalfield of South Wales. Up here, on the crest of the pass over Rhondda Mountain, we're over half a mile above that 5-foot seam of coal. This is the fingertip of Rhondda's northwest arm. Only 20 miles down the winding road is Cardiff and the sea. But up here, the wind blows over stones that saw the earliest life of man. And the valley is a carved and twisting gash in the moorland plateau, the flat top of North Glamorgan. To a geologist, the tale begins in the rocks of Rhondda.
Well, the early beginnings of the story of the Rhondda Valley can be taken back to at least 300 million years ago, a time geologically when most of the British area was covered with extensive coal measure forests. Each coal measure forest eventually decayed, giving rise to a great bed of peat, which was eventually to make coal. And this land on which the forest grew subsided, and the rivers brought down new sediment that covered the coal seam. Muds became mudstones, clays became shales, sands became sandstones. Towards the end of this coal measure forest period, a significant thing happened, as far as the Rhondda is concerned at least. There was a great period of deposition of sandstone. Sandstone known now as the Pennant sandstone. And this is the rock which, of course, is the major scenic feature in the Rhondda. And the rivers which have carved out our valleys have breached this plateau-like cover, giving rise to the now famous Rhondda and Rhondda and Rhondda valleys.
Below the sandstone, the black seams lie, layer upon layer, a gigantic sandwich of coal upon rock upon coal, flattened and twisted by the weight of ages. Today, you can trace some of the upper measures along the valley side, where old levels pockmark the outcrop. But at the beginning of the 19th century, only a few black furrows broke the surface of the mountain turf. Above the untapped coal was land owned by great estates like Butte and Dunraven, leased out and worked by farmers and shepherds, a solitude of sheepwalks and wooded hill slopes. The revolution that was to change it utterly began when the first industrial pioneer came to the valley.
It began here at Dinas, a century and a half ago. This patch of black shale on which I'm now standing is all that now marks the site of the first pit in Rhondda. It was in 1809 that Walter Coffin of Bridgend left the family tannery to prospect for coal here at the lower end of the valley. He started with levels driven into the mountainside, tapping the two upper seams of coal. Then, in 1812, he sank this pit. 40 yards down, his men struck the rich Ringacht seam, the Rhondda number 3. It was this seam, nearly 3 feet thick, that became known throughout the country as Coffin's coal.
Early levels and the first pit made little difference as yet to the valley. It was still a rustic economy of sheep farming and forestry and domestic crops, and the crafts of smith and sawyer and miller that sufficed a self-reliant community.
This was Coffin's second pit in Rhondda. It's walled up now and overgrown, but the shaft is still there, under the ferns and brambles, reaching down 80 yards to the tunneled roads below. Under this ground, with naked lights and with only the most primitive ventilation, 300 men and over 100 boys hacked, sweated, cut the coal through the long hours of darkness. And along this narrow west bank of the river, between the two Dinas pits, in Company Cottage or lodging house, lived the first mining community of the Rhondda. It was the first smudge of dark mound and grey stone on the green pattern of the valley.
There's not much left of this first industrial chapter in the story. Much of the old Dinas lies flattened under post-war factory sites. Many of the Dinas people have been rehoused elsewhere. What's left is practically deserted, awaiting the council shovel and bulldozer. The stone debris along the riverside that once housed a harsh and vibrant life of its own. In the derelict cottages and the gaunt tenements, the windows are empty sockets, blind eyes now above an empty lane, where once the coal trams groaned down the rough track to the canal and Cardiff. Once, every room here held a bed, and every bed a miner. Along the Dinas Road, the pubs still bear the names of the farmlands on which they were built, but they no longer slake the thirst and temper of that age of hard labor. Nothing remains of those first mining families of Rhondda, nothing but names lost in the crumbling burial ground below Ebenezer Chapel. These first people were country folk, laborers from the farms of Rhondda and from the Vale of Glamorgan. Here, the godly among them set up a Methodist cause in 1825. At Cummer, a mile or so lower down the valley, the earliest nonconformist cause in Rhondda had long been established. Farmers and their families, riding here on Sundays to worship at the Independent Chapel in the year 1847, could see below them as they rode, on the bank above the river, another pit being sunk. This was another and successful search for the number 3 seam. The monopoly of Walter Coffin and the growing sale of his house coal had brought up to Rhondda a Cardiff shipping merchant, George Insole. It was Insole who sank the Cummer Old Pit and who sank 2 more pits within a few years. These first coal owners were speculators concerned with the profits of speculation. With cheap, unskilled labor and primitive methods, speed of output was the vital factor, not safety of working. Overmen and firemen were far too few. The working day was 12 hours and more, the atmosphere foul with gases and the lack of ventilation. And a quarter of the labor force was juvenile. Boys began at 6 years old, opening and closing the air doors. On them rested the safety of the workings. Out of the darkness of those early pits come the echoes of their voices, the Dinas lads who gave evidence to the Commission on Child Labour in 1842.
My name is Philip Davis. I am 10 years of age. I've been driving horses below ground 3 years. I work 12 hours a day. I never was at school.
My name is Matthew Lewis. I began to work when I was 7. I was burnt by the fire damp when I was winding the head wall. Some others was burnt at the same time, one almost to death.
It was these boys, pallid, stunted, and broken before their time, and the brute strength and endurance of their fathers, who raised the coal and built the fortunes of their masters. The first tram of coal raised in a new venture was a matter for celebration amongst owners and shareholders, rejoicing safely above the ground. Disaster, like the Cummer explosion of 1856, that killed 114 men and boys, was inevitable in these gas-ridden and ill-managed pits. The daily accident rate was appalling. Lacking all safety, men were crushed or burnt or suffocated or drowned. And with a packed jury at the inquests, there was no question of compensation awards against the owners or their managers. For widow or orphan, there was only the final humiliation of parish relief. But mining, with all its brutal profit and loss, was still confined to the shallow house coal seams below Porth and Dinas. The steam coal, which was already making the nearby Aberdare Valley prosperous, was still to be found in Rhondda. It was discovered first here, at the top of the Rhondda Fawr at Treherbert. In his diary, W.S. Clark, mineral agent to the Butte estate, records, 16th of October, 1851, we commenced sinking the pit at 6 o'clock this morning. Here, below this ground, the upper 4 feet seam of steam coal was proved at a depth of 125 yards. By 1855, the colliery was complete, and on December the 21st, the first train of 38 wagons of Rhondda steam coal went down the newly opened railway to Cardiff. This was the turning point. Under the farmlands and sheep walks, up and down the length of Rhondda, the big, deep shafts were driven to the steam coal, down to the 2 feet 9 and the 4 feet and 6 feet seams. In 20 years, 25 new pits were at work in the two valleys. To the men who owned the lands or mineral rights of Rhondda, men like Lord Bute or David Davis of Llandinam, or the coal-exporting brothers John and Richard Corey of Cardiff, here was a measureless reservoir of wealth. Year by year, as the sinkings continued and new seams were opened, revenues and sales and profits rose to new and gratifying heights. In Cardiff and in the Vale of Glamorgan, the mock medieval castles and stately houses flourished, well away to the south of the valley that paid for them. Absenteeism in Rhondda began with the owners. But some were local and stayed. Some were immigrants who stayed. A Scot, for example, who gained a monumental place, Archibald Hood from Ayrshire. In 1864, he struck the deeper steam coal measures below Llwynapere to found the Glamorgan colliery and the township that rapidly grew up around it. Hood settled at Glencornell. The men who came to work for him were housed in humbler fashion. The hasty rows along the side of the hill above the pit became the pattern of Rhondda housing, the terrace. Over the mountain, in the twin valley of Rhondda Fach, David Davis of Blaenguawr and his son Lewis Davis sank the first pit at Ferndale. Above the pit, across the valley, stood the colliery offices. Today, small boys and wandering sheep have shattered the windows and ravaged the interiors. All that's left is a debris of forgotten paperwork and the memories of past profits. And memories, too, of the human cost of coal, the long lists of fractures and amputations, the record of accidents that marked a man for compensation. And above the offices, the family house, now derelict and soon to be rebuilt by local authority as a home for the old. A final act, perhaps, of compensation. Lower down the valley at Anasir, we can see this proximity of pithead and big house as it must have been in the latter half of the century. James Thomas began life as a door boy and hewed coal himself until he'd saved enough to begin a mining venture at Tŷ Newydd. In 1877, he sank the Standard Colliery here. To local owners like these, there was a paternalism within limits, the limits allowed by Victorian ideas of the right relation between capital and labour. The masters, even the local ones, were screened by distance and by social position from the people who manned their pits. What sort of people were they, these miners and their families of a century ago, and how did they live? Says one Victorian observer,
"In the good times of coal, a few of the colliers were provident and put by money for a rainy day, but the mass spent their money lavishly."
But 2 strikes in demand of better pay and a bitter 5-month lockout in 1875 must have left little money for extravagant living. The strikes won a brief pay increase. The lockout that followed ended in new wage cuts, sent women and children to the tips scavenging for coal, and broke the miners' first attempt at industrial union.
The folk who were not chapel-goers were catered for by the public houses. There was much drinking. Pay was fortnightly, and on those pay Saturdays, as they were called, disreputable scenes were common.
Remarks another observer, certainly there was distraction in violence, in the dogfight or the bare-fist battle on the mountain. Social life reflected the even greater violence of working life. As pits grew deeper, so they grew more dangerous. 2 great explosions in 2 years at Ferndale claimed 231 lives. In the second half of the century, 800 miners died in colliery explosions in Rhondda. The numbers who died in individual accidents underground during those years will never be known. In 1 year alone, 1887, the South Wales Miners' Provident Society dealt with 10,000 cases of disablement, 1 man injured in every 4 who joined. And in that year, fatal accidents placed on the funds 74 widows and 161 children. And rough printed ballads and broadsheets, hawked about the valleys at a penny a copy, made crude memorial for the dead. But every disaster brought its tale of courage, and none finer than at the flooding of Tŷ Newydd pit in 1877. While officials and doctors waited above, the rescuers, working in ceaseless relays and without regard for their own safety, fought to reach their trapped comrades. After 10 days and nights, 4 men and a lad of 16 were plucked still living from their tomb of rock. 5 had died in the first rush of water, but the survivors and their rescuers had become national heroes and were posed in solemn fashion before the cameras of the day. And names like Isaac Pride and Happy Dodds are legends still in Rhondda. Among those men at Tŷ Newydd was a colliery manager, Daniel Thomas, awarded the Albert Medal for his gallantry. At the Dinas explosion 2 years later, he led the rescue efforts, and he died leading a rescue team into the afterdamp at Pennagraig in 1884. And around his memorial are the names of those who died in the Dinas pit, buried here in a mass grave on the hillside. Here at Treallow lie the past generations, many of them people who came here in the booming years of the steam coal sinkings. They came at first locally, tramping over the mountains in search of work from the declining ironworks of Merthyr and the older mining districts. Piece rates and day wages were often 25% higher in Rhondda than elsewhere. As more pits were sunk, migration into Rhondda became a flood. From all parts of Wales and from beyond its borders, leaving the wretched poverty of the land, the labourers and their families poured into the valley. In 1870, there were 20,000 people in Rhondda. In the next 10 years, the population more than doubled itself. By the turn of the century, 113,000 lived in the 2 narrow valleys, a crossbred mixture with a strength and vigour all its own. Among those immigrants were the ancestors of Will Whitehead, miners' leader.
My father worked in the pits in the Rhondda. As a matter of fact, he left the Forest of Dean, an agricultural area, to come to Rhondda because there was coal in the earth. My mother too, she came with her family, or at least her family came before her, down to the Rhondda in order to open pits. They came down with the Davis Landinham family, and both came from areas where the land offered little reward for working people, and they were determined to come down to what was virtually the Black Klondike.
This Black Klondike bore all the signs of greedy haste in the making. Most of the trees were stripped from the mountains for pit props. The mining waste was spilled in great tips over the green slopes. As in the early days at Dinas, some of the owners held their mineral rights under short lease, and their sole aim was to get the coal out quickly. In the 60s and 70s, few owners did more than throw up wooden huts or a few streets of cottages for their first workmen. The vast majority of Rhondda houses were built by private, speculative builders. Mostly, they used the local pennant stone for the small 5-roomed houses. Street upon street, terrace above terrace, they shaped the urban straggle that is Rhondda's present legacy. And there were never enough houses. In that explosion of population in the 80s, in almost every home there were lodgers. Beds were often occupied day and night, and the valley stood high on the blacklist of Victorian overcrowding. This teeming life was often rude and sometimes riotous, yet many of these immigrants brought with them a native culture already formed and a stern faith in nonconformity. In Tonpentra, for example, the Reverend Alban Davis explains the beginnings of community.
It must be remembered that the coal industry developed itself, as far as the Rhondda is concerned, around the pits. It is a succession of villages. The people came from, in particular, they came from the west, from Carmarthenshire, Pembrokeshire and Cardiganshire. They brought with them their own customs, and they brought with them, likewise, their own denominational belief. The result was that every denomination had its setting within the particular village. In the first creative stage in the life of the community itself, the churches played a dual task, concerned of necessity about worship, but also about sustaining and developing the cultural life of the people. The whole life of the valley, as it were, centered around the churches, and they were definitely in the center. One must remember also that the churches contained the two elements, both masters and men. These new masters, or pioneers, actually were radical nonconformists who sought the new liberty to establish and to discover ways of adventure and investment. These men were regarded almost in a feudal fashion by the miners themselves.
In those early days, it was possible for masters and men to worship together and to sing together in the great singing meeting, the Kimanvagani.
I suppose one of the most remarkable Gamanvas ever took place at Carmel, Treherbert, not long after the Kama disaster, when Dr. Joseph Parry had written an anthem, I think it was called the Miners' Anthem, and incorporating the hymn which the entombed miners sang as they awaited deliverance. Well, this so gripped the choir and congregation that they kept on repeating it until eventually, I understand, it was sung about 17 times. By the time they'd come to the end, the conductor himself lay exhausted in the pulpit, and the singing was going on regardless.
The ministers of those days were eloquent and patriarchal figures. As conductor and schoolmaster Jack Hayden Davis claims, they were the real leaders of their communities.
They were the focal points of culture. For instance, I myself was taught by my minister, Reverend Canon Evans, G&L, not gin and lime as some of the wags said, but graduate and licentiate of the Tonics of our college, which as he taught me and gave me really the only musical certificate that I possess. Also we were taught in school by the class teachers, But one of the notable names, I think, was that of Moses Owen Jones, M.O. Jones, M.O., who came to Treherbert in about the 1860s. He was a pioneer composer, and his interest in music and his friendship with a local printer, the Isaac Jones of Caxton Press, led to the installation there of the first press that could print tonic solfa in Wales. And it's a fact that at one period, all the Gymanfa programs in tonic solfa were printed at Caxton Press, Treherbert.
In the last of the Victorian years in Rhondda, this chapel-based culture, with its stern disciplines and rigid code of behaviour, was the strong core of community life. For most of these people, there was work to be had and pay to be earned. There was food for the large families, the families that bred more miners in their turn, as a retired miner like Sam Samuels remembers.
But there's one thing about it, we always had plenty of food. Always had, because my father was a good worker. Well, he was a miner all his life. He liked his pint of beer. Drank a lot of beer in his time, there's no doubt about it. But to me, he was a good father. I don't think any of us children want to complain anything at all about him. We was all told 18 in family. There were seven brothers and 9 sisters. And a very good mother.
For Sam and for many a lad like him, school days were short, and he was down the pit with his father at 11 years of age. In those days, the need for work and the money it brought into the family meant an early end to childhood.
My grandfather used to tell me that when he started work in the Chidraw colliery, where, by the way, 4 successive generations of my family worked one after the other, he used to be carried to work as a boy of 7 or 8 in the winter time, half asleep over his father's shoulder, descend the mine on a Monday morning before dawn, come up after sunset, and so on through the week. And he thought that Sunday was so called because it was on that day only in winter time that he saw the sun.
As Rhondda moved into the 20th century, the pattern was laid, the mould hardened. Pit and terrace, pub and chapel became the shape and substance of the long, winding street. Ahead lay the struggles and the bitter breaking of the old order, the stormy path to Tonapandi and the lean and angry years.
I came here with my parents about 62 years ago, as a boy of 13, to work in the mine. And you know, when I look back and think of those hard work, low wages, the struggle to make ends meet, I sometimes wonder how we survived it all. But we did, you know. The mine has always been a fighter, and he still is one if there's need to. When I started as a boy, my wages was a shilling a day, canning lights and opening doors. And believe me, a little boy comes from the country, never heard the language we heard then up there as we did in the mines. I came one of the finest curses I ever went in the ground. And halliers at that time, you know, they were wonderful characters. They always used to tease me to get me out of temper just to hear me cursing, you see. And I started to chew tobacco. They caught hold of me one day and put me on my back, put a tobacco in my mouth, and kept me there till I chewed it. And boy, wasn't I sick. But I had the taste of it, and I carried on with it. Well, I had about 8 or 9 lamps by my side, you know, hanging in a sort of a manhole. And if a collier came around, of course, no lamps for colliers, only for halliers. If he had tobacco, he'd have a lamp. No tobacco, no lamp. Well, I was doing that job about 6 months. Then I came to Treorchy, and I had a job with the presenter of the Methodist Pile. And I was a good boy with him. And with him I worked until I was about 18. Then I had a place of my own.
A boy like Prussell Williams, growing up in Rhondda at the beginning of this century, well knew his working destiny. And school was only a short interval between the cradle and the pit. But for the children of the valleys, as Jack Hayden Davis recalls, the game of life began in the street.
There, on a winter's night, we would gather under the lamppost or around the window of a little shop, a little sweet shop, and that was the meeting place of the gang, of the street gang. We had our own games, daylight games, and games after dark as well. I suppose cat and dog would be the great daylight game, marbles, one and over. There are a host of names that come back. They've all vanished now, mainly because of the traffic making the street a very dangerous place to be in. But street life played a great part in our existence.
There were no cars. You just had the horses and the traps and the carts. And so there was no difficulty at all in playing any of these uproarious games in the streets. And in the same way, you were always susceptible to the temptation to go up to the pit and make yourself a nuisance by playing around amongst the trams. And if you were very quick, of course, spotting the bobby who would chase you off the premises. Then, of course, there was the mountains. We loved going up to the mountains and playing on the mountainside. And some of the streams were still fishable, and during the fine weather it was very pleasant indeed to go there and with your ducking drawers and dive in and swim about and plash, by way, I suppose, of being a rehearsal to the great time when you would go down with the Sunday school trip to Barry or Porthcawl and swim around in the great big sea itself.
Youngsters at the junior school at Ustrad still play as happily as they did when Sir Benboy Thomas went there as a boy. But those dominant shadows of shaft and pithead no longer lie across school days or over the home itself.
The whole of my home was dominated by the fact that my father earned his living in the coal mines. He would come in as black as the ace of spades of an evening, a late afternoon, and the whole household would be concerned to return him to the white color. And my mother would be concerned to get the dirty clothes out of the way and well shaken and aired and prepared for the morning. And then I would hear him go out, I suppose sometimes even before 6 o'clock in the morning, to his work. And what happened in the mines was the thing that really colored the whole of our lives.
In these streets, in these closely packed houses, life achieved a great sense of solidarity and of genuine concern for the members of each family.
My mother always regarded Friday night as set aside to go to her sister's house to help with the repairing of the clothes, children's clothes, the washing of the clothes perhaps, to help in the baking, making cakes or possibly bread for the family. And then the other elder sister would probably go up on the Monday morning to give a hand with the large wash of this large family.
Women took a great deal of pride in having a big family, and it was a pleasure to see them going to chapel on a Sunday with all the family together, filling probably up about 2 pews. It was a great accomplishment then to be the mother of 8 or 9 or 10. But today, of course, things are different. Today, the woman that's had 8 or 9 or 10 children is looked upon with a great deal of disdain and contempt. And the pride of place today, and the boast undoubtedly with many women, is that they've only got a family of 2, what they call a pigeon pair.
As Yori Thomas says, there was pride in family, pride too in a respectability as sharply defined and firmly based as the community itself. To many, the new century looked fair and prosperous, even adventurous and go ahead, when up the main street and around the Gossip's Corner, tramway lines were laid, and the first trams rattled their way to the top end of the valleys. There was pride in appearance, pride in a brave turnout of volunteers like these, ready for any emergency, even if performance sometimes dimmed that brassy splendor. And the pawn shop was a reminder that pride was still based on the uneasy economics of coal. But the big events were still domestic rather than economic. The long and solemn funeral, perhaps, most of all. It appealed to a people often close to the realities of death and loss. And dominating the scene like great tents of stone were the chapels, now in their spiritual and physical heyday.
This is Nebo Ostrad, the mother church of the Baptist churches in the Rhondda Valley, and the place where I was brought up in a religious sense. It would be difficult to overestimate the meaning of an institution of this kind to the folk of those days, because it was here that they identified themselves with a framework, with an outlook that gave meaning to their lives, that gave purpose to their lives, and that would then activate them in their relationships with their members and in the way in which they would personally try to conduct themselves. And in addition, of course, within the church, all kinds of activities, apart from the preaching services and the Sunday schools, to enable young people to use and to develop the gifts that were in them.
Much of the social entertainment of the day was still chapel-based. The popular playhouse, like the old Theatre Royal at Tonopandi, was still regarded with suspicion by the devout chapel-goer. But these were days in which the melodrama of real life was gathering its own momentum.
Well, I suppose the melting pot of Rhondda reached its highest temperatures in the early years of this century, say from 1900 on, when we had terrific clashes between the incoming people from different parts of the world, people with different interests. It was a violent time, violent in religion with religious revivals, violent on the political side with the riots and all the rest of it. And then, of course, we had the great vigor of competitive singing. I suppose choirs formed themselves mainly around the chapels in those days, and competition was a terrific thing. We had a choir in Blanacombe Chapel of 400 voices at that time, conducted by a young man, Evan Watkins. Well, he was actually 16. It was called Cora Cruttin. And their famous piece was another violent piece of music, which is called Stone Him to Death.
In 1904, the religious revival flared briefly into emotional life.
One can speak of the revival itself as being an organized effort on the part of the churches to renew its defenses against the new political spirits.
It was an emphasis upon saving souls, an emphasis on otherworldliness, and once souls, so to speak, had been saved, and once they felt that their future had been laid up in heaven, there was little else left for them by way of direction from the church and from the pulpit in regard to life in this world. And after all, it's life in this world that is of significance to us as human beings. And it so happened that at that very same time, there was developing in politics and economics a creative movement for social betterment, which I am sorry to say wasn't taken into the church to the measure that it might have been, with the result that it developed apart from it. And so you had many of these young men actually disowned by the church, the young men who went in to radical politics, to the ILP, to syndicalism, and later into what we call labor politics and possibly the communist movement. That is, the young people whom I used to listen to talking up by the Bridge End Hotel in Tonpentre or on the mountainside in Penrhys, people calling the workers to work out their own salvation.
There is a great date in the life of the valley. It is the date of the year of the Tonopandi strike. Now there you have the division and the final division and separation between the churches and the new radical elements.
Down there to my left is Dunraven Street, one of the main shopping streets in Rhondda. Northwards that way lies the road to Llywelyn and Tonpentre. And up that steep hill there, past the smart new flats and the smart new club, is the way to Clydach Vale. Down that narrow street a few months ago came the silent army of Rhondda miners, escorting their dead comrades from the Cambrian pit to their long home on the mountainside at Triallow. They walked in sorrow where their fathers marched in anger. For this is Pandy Square in Tonopandi, This was the storm centre in the days of the Cambrian Combine strike. Because of what happened here, the date 1910 and the name Tonapandi are forever part of the racial memory of these mining valleys.
The road to Pandy Square and to the great outburst of industrial and political violence starts a long way back from the Tonapandi of today. Outside the pub on the square, the men still squat miner fashion and talk together with the same dry, bantering humour, but the talk is not of old battles or of the men who led the strife. Rhondda today has little time for history, said one of them. The past is behind us. Let it stay that way. The older men, sunning themselves on the benches, will point out the first shop window smashed in the riots. But the names of the past leaders stir only faint memories now. Names like Ablett and Rees, Hopler and Smith, that were once the ready coin of argument. Perhaps from one of them, there'll be a word about Mabon.
A very fine old gentleman, one of the best gentlemen, no doubt, we've ever had in Rhondda here. Well, in fact, we had one day on a Monday, and we had a stop day for it. And they called that Mabon's Day. That was a holiday.
William Abraham, the legendary Mabon. For 50 years a trade union leader, for 35 years Member of Parliament for Rhondda. His counsel was always conciliation, his slogan, half a loaf is better than no bread. He became the miners' representative on the Joint Sliding Scale Association. This pegged wages up or down to the selling price of coal and gave 17 years of uneasy peace to the coal field. But younger leaders demanded that profits, not selling price, should determine pay. In 1893, the Holliers' strike brought violence and troops to the Rhondda. In 1898, the sliding scale was abandoned and the South Wales Miners' Federation was born. As if in answer, the ruthlessly efficient D.A. Thomas, later Lord Rhondda, began the grouping of pits that by 1910 had become the powerful Cambrian Combine. In 1905, two major explosions had shaken Rhondda, at the Cambrian pit at Clydach and at Wattstown. Between them, they killed 150 men. In one street in Wattstown, every house mourned a man lost. Such disasters as these inflamed opinion, even amongst men hardened to the daily toll of accident.
To see that procession coming from the colliery, we knew that if the stretcher would be carried at waist high, that the man was only injured. If the stretcher was being carried on the shoulders, we knew that he had been killed. And we would, as children, would walk behind, and very often we would see the blood dripping from the stretcher onto the floor, and just see the boots of the man coming from underneath the sack.
Finally, in 1909 came the 8 Hours Act. This reduced hours of work, but it also reduced earnings. Many older men were dismissed, there was still no payment for small coal, and, the vital sparking point of strike, no extra pay for work in bad seams. Veteran miners leader Will Mainwaring looks back now across the years at the relative strengths of masters and men poised as they were for battle.
When the Cambrian Combine strike started, the Cambrian Combine Colliery Company was really in clover, because the Coal Owners Association had agreed that they would subsidize the combine to the tune of 2 shillings per ton for all the coal that was not raised for a whole 12 months. You can imagine what it means. 12,000 miners, 12,000 tons of coal per day, 12,000 times 2 shillings a ton, right through the many months of that struggle. Now that's where the strength and the resources on the owner's side appear to be. On our side, trade unionism divided, as it was then much more than now in South Wales, about 20 different districts. Rhondda was simply one of them, and the combine here was only a portion of this Rhondda. Now there was the problem. If we were going to enter into the struggle, the challenge was bound to come. What resources had we? Well, we had to make a very serious decision. Were we going to enter into a struggle and hope to carry it through and win on the basis of a strike pay? we had none.
In August 1910, the spark was set to the powder. At the Naval Colliery Pennagraig, one of the Cambrian combine pits, 70 men demanded a piece rate of 2 6 a ton to work the difficult Butte seam. The management offered 1 9 a ton.
First, the company, to enforce the proffered terms upon the naval workmen, tendered notices to 800 men. Naturally, this aroused the opposition of naval and the other combine lodges. And we decided unanimously, that when the notices to the 800 came to an end, that also would be the signal for a stoppage of the whole 12,000 men.
The story of the violence that followed the beginning of the Cambrian strike is a tangled web of conflicting and far from impartial accounts. Certainly, in that autumn of 1910, there was a brooding anger and great bitterness throughout mid-Rhondda, and large numbers of extra police had been drafted into the area in anticipation of trouble. Most of them were deployed to guard colliery premises, and at the Glamorgan colliery at Llwynarpur, the owners decided to maintain the pumps and ventilation by bringing in stokers from outside. When, on the night of the 7th of November, the strikers learnt of this import of blackleg labour, they marched on the colliery and fiercely attacked the police lodged inside. After a sharp skirmish, the strikers were driven off and more police were rushed into the valley. On the following day, a miners' demonstration in Tonnapandi itself was broken up by repeated charges and the free use of police truncheons. The miners fought back with fists and stones, and there were broken heads and limbs on both sides of the battle. During the day and night that followed, windows were smashed and shops were looted. Hastily, shopkeepers boarded up their windows and assumed a state of siege. Tonnapandi was now no longer a local disturbance, and the Home Secretary was asked for military aid. He sent 500 Metropolitan Police with troops in reserve. Many in Rhondda have reviled this action of Churchill's, but Will Mainwaring takes a different view.
We never thought that Vincent Churchill had exceeded his natural responsibility as Home Secretary. The military that came into the area did not commit one single act that aroused the slightest resentment by the strikers. On the contrary, we regarded the military as having come in the form of friends in order to modify the otherwise ruthless attitude of the police forces.
At Tonnapandi and Pennagraig, there was more violence at the end of November. Many strikers were arrested and sentenced. Officials at the pits manned the pumps under guard, and all through the sullen months of 1911, troops and large forces of police remained in the valley. The strike dragged on amidst a welter of manifestos and arguments. Negotiations between the South Wales Miners' Federation and the owners, with the Board of Trade holding the ring, continued in an atmosphere charged with fierce dispute. The original demand of the men for fairer pay for working a bad or difficult seam was changed to a call for a minimum wage for all workers. By August 1911, the strike was 10 months old. In mid-Rhondda, there was intense and widespread suffering. The impetus of violence slowly died as miners and their big families grew wretched with need. The resources of the unions were almost exhausted. In the local chapels, men climbed the pulpit steps to receive their weekly strike pay. Now, even this pittance was reduced. The end was inevitable. By September, the men had accepted the owners' terms. But to their leaders, this was only an interval before renewing the struggle.
We were then satisfied. Time has now arrived when we can safely say we'll accept the terms that have been proffered to us, we'll return to work and prepare for the other struggle which must come within 3 months. And one thing I was rather proud of, the Cambrian, my own lodge, having been through the whole 10-month struggle, only partially returned to work as yet. Indeed, I had still another year to go before I returned to work. But having done all that, we balloted the Cambrian miners. Are you now prepared to join in another strike, a struggle for the minimum wage? And the highest majority in the whole of Britain came from the Cambrian Lodge.
In support of a new and more militant unionism, Mainwaring and his fellow leaders set up the unofficial Reform Committee and published a celebrated and explosive pamphlet.
The purpose we had in mind in preparing this miner's next step was to consider with our fellow miners everywhere, does the existing trade union structure fulfill what you think is required? Or would you agree with us that we need a completely transformed structure of trade unionism, a new unionism for the miners of this country? And eventually, we appointed 8 persons to summarize the whole thing and write it up in the form of a pamphlet. And thus, eventually, it became published by ourselves in time to influence the National Conference of the Miners of Great Britain, and produced a national minimum wage under the then Prime Minister H.H. Asquith. So we had a final victory to what we had aimed to do.
The Cambrian strike not only led the drive to a minimum wage, it also broke the power of the older miners' leaders in Rhondda. Conciliation and arbitration were rejected by the younger elements, and Mabon's day was done. In 1912, the owners were faced with the first national strike of coal miners in Great Britain. For 6 weeks, conference and mediation failed to move either side until the government intervened and the principle of a minimum wage was accepted by Parliament. The year that followed saw the high peak of coal output. Nearly 10 million tons were raised in Rhondda. Demand was high and so were profits, but mining was still a cheap method industry.
Well, the work underground of those days were very hard, mind. The labourer's wage was only 3 and 6 to 4 shillings. The collier, of course, if you had a good seam of coal, he'd be all right. But if you had a poor seam, he had to live on what the coal he could produce, especially large coal, because there was no payment paid for small coal then, until the Minimum Wage Act came in. And then it wasn't much better, because the same thing happened then. If you had a poor place, you wouldn't be able to make your money up to the minimum. You'd have to fight for it. And we had to fight. You used to stand on top of that pit, clothes soaking wet, with sweat, wait for the manager to come up. And of course, he'd always stay down longer on a Friday than he would any other day, you see, because he knew we were up there. And then the fire would start.
An Act of Parliament was one thing. Getting your rights at the pithead was another. Yet these last years of peace in Europe were the halcyon days of the trade. Ocean and Insole, Ferndale and Standard, Corey and Cambrian. Truck after loaded truck spread a black trail to factory or docks. The whole motive force of industry came from the deep seams of places like Rhondda. And across the seas, along the imperial trade routes, were the coaling stations, the great stores of bunker coal to feed the shipping of the world. In 1914, Corey Brothers alone owned 80 such depots, and the roaring furnaces of liners like Mauritania, breaking the record for the Atlantic crossing, were stoked on coal hewed in the pits of Park and Dare and Maindee. When it came, the war maintained the boom years in the valleys. Britain's great battle fleets were coal-fired. So were the factories of war. Although many Rhondda men joined the forces, coal was so vital to the war effort that by the end of 1916, the government had limited the recruiting of miners. In light and heavy industry, women took over men's work. The miners returned to the pits, and by 1917, the industry was brought under national control. The Board of Trade regulated wages, conditions, and hours of work, everything except profits. And despite the names on the war memorials, these were good years for Rhondda. But they were soon over. By 1921, Rhondda was again on strike and marching to Wattstown to call out the pump men. This national coal strike had followed the handing back of the mines to the owners and the drastic wage cuts that came from falling markets and rising costs. In bitter anger, the men demanded the pits be abandoned. Safety officials were forced out, and hauliers brought up their horses to join the workless men on the surface. It lasted 3 months. In Rhondda, strike action became a series of struggles to promote or to prevent the flooding of the pits. But despite protest and picketing, there was little violence. One national newspaper said, "The 40,000 miners of the Rhondda Valley are conducting themselves with commendable calm, and not a single case of lawlessness has been reported recently." Some pits were flooded, and once again troops and extra police came to the valley. The strike ended in hardship and defeat, wage cuts and victimization. Once again, the people of Rhondda had only themselves to turn to in their need.
The feeling was very warm in the Rhondda in those days, much different to now. Everybody was so near to each other, and if they could do you a good turn, they would do it. But the neighbors were as one. Everybody would help one another.
Miners and their families in the Rhondda were not prepared to go down in this struggle against social and natural forces. They recognized that they must have food, they must have houses, they must have clothing, these elementary essentials of life. And so they decided that if present society wouldn't give them, then they must change society. And this is what they set about doing. And Rhondda became one of the most militant and at the same time probably the most democratic place on the face of the earth.
Will Whitehead, miners' leader, on the 20s and 30s in Rhondda. Along this derelict and now deserted street called the Concretes, soon to be razed to the ground, you can still feel something of the atmosphere of decay and depression that began in the valley with the general strike of 1926.
No one can credit how hard it was in the Rhondda in the two strikes. There was no opening at all to have or go anywhere until everybody had gone miserable. The men were very miserable. They'd hung around the corners from early till late, didn't know what was to do with themselves. They'd do a little turn for cigarettes, wherever it was possible to get a little job to do. There wasn't a lot around because everybody was in the same boat.
All in the same boat, too, were the men who marched about the idle valleys through that long summer. Men who were fiercely partisan and utterly committed to the struggle, right or wrong.
I don't think it was the wrong of the men. It was the wrong of the coal owners, it was. Not the men. Because the men was forced in the end to go back because of anger of the children. Driven back to work. That's what it was every time.
But in the beginning, there was a spirit amongst them of optimism and holiday, and a welcome chance to make sporting carnival. In the 9 days of general strike, and all through the dreary months when the miners fought on alone, Rhondda men were leaders, as grimly implacable as the owners who opposed them. Men like A.J. Cook, who would become secretary of the Miners' Federation of Great Britain in 1924. Noah Ablett, veteran of Tonopandi in 1910. And Arthur Horner, later to be champion of Rhondda's unemployed. Unemployment on a national scale now became the post-strike pattern. This was a world adrift in an economic chaos to which there seemed no end or answer. In all the industrial areas of Britain, the queues lengthened through the years, the queues for relief, the dole queues that stretched wearily outside the labour exchange in every town and valley, the hopeless quest for work, for anything, and the losing fight against poverty.
There can be no argument or doubt about the evidence of poverty. It was there for everyone to see. In the faces of the children, pinched and wan, lackluster eyes, on their clothes, which were the clothes of adults cut down, or else were the clothes of older children and were ill-fitting. their shoes with the toes poking out of the front of the boots. Then there was the general lack of energy with the children. If there was one consolation, it was that we were all poor together. And in times of strike, we all went to the soup kitchens together. Every boy had a Tate and Lyle tin cut down to size and a handle of tin soldered on. And this tin was basin and cup together. His soup went into this tin and so did his cocoa at the soup kitchen.
The soup kitchens have left with many in Rhondda the memory of pride swallowed with the stew and the cocoa, memories of full bellies in an empty existence. For Yorrie Thomas, memories of the volunteers who ran them.
All the soup kitchens, of course, were well organized. We had certain members of the lodge committee in charge of the provisions, doing the ordering, and you had others in charge of the fires. You had some old boys who'd been in the army as cooks volunteering to do that work, and used to come to the kitchens at 5 o'clock in the morning to prepare. And mind you, it took some preparation too, because we had young lads then spending most of the mornings on the mountain playing football, coming down, of course, with a hunger. And by gosh, you ought to see the size of their basins when they come in to have those meals. It was the pride of most miners in those days, when wages were low, of course. They all had allotments. Well, when the strike came, and there was need for providing people with food, these men went to their allotments and brought their vegetables, cabbages, peas, potatoes, whatever they had, in order to help the soup kitchen to carry on its function.
You can see marks on the mountains at size now, where we've been digging the coal, sheltering for sheep and all that it is now today, with grass growing all over it.
The coal was provided by men volunteering to go in rota to the mountains into these levels, and mind you, risking their lives. Some of them were killed really in these levels. Some of them had their backs broken in their endeavor to get coal for themselves, of course, and a quota was always given to the soup kitchens in order to feed the fires.
The problem then was for desperate men to maintain their families, for the dole was little enough. And so what did they do? They had to revert to desperate measures. There is one famous street in the Rhondda. It has 2 or 3 names. Its proper name I shall not tell you. The 2 other names are Sheepskin Avenue or Mutton Tump. And it was known that in that street, men used to take it by turn to kill the sheep and share the meat out amongst the families in the street. And the police never found out how they did it.
Under the crude banner of hunger, desperate men marched out of the valleys to join other workless comrades from Wales, from the Midlands, from the north, on the roads to London, to publicise and proclaim their need. The hunger marches of the 20s and 30s spread a stain of shame over the face of Britain. They were the symbols of disaster in finance and trade, even more so, disaster in terms of human relations and the concern of man for man.
Prior to the Depression itself, as a miners' agent, I knew that there were 45,000 miners regularly employed and, of course, members of the organization. After this tremendous somersault in trading conditions, I found 35,000 miners unemployed. And you can imagine the social effect of such a situation.
By 1932, over half of all the men in Rhondda were out of work. Many of them were destined never in their lives to work again.
Year by year, as they rolled by, these people, men and women alike, gradually settled down to the acceptance of the standard of life which was possible on the basis of unemployment benefit, in some cases some additional assistance from national assistance. But how they settled down to that and lived as best they could. And at the same time, exemplary people in every respect, fighting against misfortune. Gosh, what courage the people had. Yeah.
I remember we were waiting for the Friday for the dole. My husband would go to the shop and fetch just sugar, butter, tea, cheese. And then the children would say, "Now, Mum, for a nice dinner with fresh cheese and bread and butter."
I remember we used to go down to the Carry Farms there on a Friday. There used to be a market there, to jockey. And you would have a leg of mutton for about a bob, 1 and 6, 2 shirts for half a crown, cheap fruits, and fish. I remember we used to go down on fish day and have a hake about a yard long, for a bob. We'd sting it on our back and walk all the way to Turbot.
Well, of course, the family today won't see what we've seen. They are having family allowance to help them, which is a great boon to them. We have to keep our children on 2 shillings. And I had to send my children away when they were 14, my 2 girls, to earn their own living.
The plight of the miner came to the notice of the Society of Friends and of Emma Noble in particular, who got permission to come to Rhondda on a 3-week observation visit. She stayed with her husband among the Rhondda miner for just under 20 years.
As Glyn Jones says, the immediate task was material, to clothe children and parents in need, to distribute the help that now began to arrive from outside. But more than this, the Society of Friends set up an educational settlement at Mysore Harve to help the rebuilding of local and communal life.
Men were now anxious to get together in some sort of organization where they could vent their feelings about the whole thing and try to do something about it. The establishment of unemployed clubs followed and grew up overnight. Many clubs sprang up like mushrooms overnight, and we saw established in these centers in a very short time a boot repairing shop for the repairing of members' shoes and boots, the workshop for carpentry where household repairs could take place and furniture made, and it is the proud boast of one young man at the time that he made every stick of furniture before he got married. And that furniture is still in use today.
Oh, they were a big boon. Believe you me, our men would have gone out of their minds because it took them from their homes, because the woman could have never stood the strain of having the man in the home knowing how he felt because he wasn't working. So of course they turned to the unemployed club, which we've got to thank the Quakers for. And I think they deserve all the credit because it's through them that we've kept our reason. Then from the men's club, the women's club formed, and they helped to keep the women, their morale up, because otherwise I believe we would have cracked up.
I was one of the because I thought that we should be close enough to it,
Already the need for coal was making itself felt in every household, and permission was granted to unemployed miners to ferret out coal from the tips, which have buried within them many tons of coal.
Our husbands, I don't mind telling you, had to go to the tip. They had to sell a bag of coal, and that helped to bring in something for the children.
I think that is the lesson of the Depression, that in moments of material need and suffering, people have a concern, a genuine concern for others. That has been totally, perhaps a strong word, almost totally eclipsed by the welfare state of today and this chasing after the bonus.
The Miners' Institute, with its library and reading room, became the Parliament of Poverty. Up the top of Rhondda, for instance, at Mardy, the Workman's Hall and its classes on Sunday afternoons bred a vivid consciousness of rights and wrongs.
This is the famous classroom at Mardy, where Arthur Horner and some of his conspirators, I think that's the right term to use, used to meet and discuss the affairs of the world. And a classroom it was in the very real sense. But the sort of things which were taught here were not the 3 R's, although they were part of it, but not them alone. What was taught here was economics, political economy, dialectical materialism, strange words these, world history, amongst other things. And the emphasis was on the thoughts, the concepts of Marx and Lenin. Classes of this sort were common throughout the whole of the Rhondda Valley in those evil days, as much as anything because men had very little other places to go, and the institute was the focal point of social contact, as it were. But not only did they teach the social sciences there, they dealt with more practical day-to-day things. So many men were unemployed, and so many were on the means test, that they were being denied the means of existence. And people like Arthur Horner and others, in such classes as this, taught men the unemployment acts, and taught them how to defeat the ways of the insurance officers, taught them how to get more money for their families. And these were the sort of things which were taught to men, in addition to the social sciences. It was, in fact, the adult university of the Rhondda, the university of hard knocks.
Few pits were working, and they were on short time. A few nailed boots still rang along the streets, but to get a job at all was a matter of chance or favour.
The queues on top of the colliery there, all waiting and queuing up for work. About 30, 40, even 50 men at a time, waiting for the manager to come out and select who you want. Here he comes, you point. You, 3, 4, perhaps 5 men, not many more. He turned around quite as if there was nobody there and say, well, you can all buzz off now, you had it.
In those years of idleness, many a man, like Trevor Parker, turned to the lofts behind the terrace and to one of the miners' abiding hobbies.
Keeping pigeons was our only little bit of pastime. We used to have our private little races, penny, tuppence or threepence entry or pigeon. We'd walk miles, as far as Merthyr or Penderyn or anywhere like spin the knife, just for the toss. Select 2 men who will let the birds go, walk in there, have a little sweep. Well, it was all clean sport and a nice bit of fun. On the weekend, we'd have a game of football. That used to be up in the old favourite place, up on the battlefield. We'd be starting about 9 o'clock. Half times would be roughly about 2 o'clock, 2:30. We'd all have to retire for dinner. Back again after dinner. Now the second half, that would be roughly about 6 or 7 hours. We're playing football non-stop.
Those were the brave days of carnival and jazz band competition. The mocking derision of the gazooka was perhaps Rhondda's reaction to depression and to a valley of workless men. In bad times or good, Rhondda still bred its own kind of sportsman, equally at home on a rough mountain pitch as in a bad place underground, and above all, as Cliff Morgan claims, great fighters.
And I look across from the Rhondda now where I'm standing and look at Penriver where Tom Thomas, one of the great fighters of the old days, used to wrestle with a bull to prove his strength before he pitted his skills in the ring against many and varied opponents. I think of Scarrett's Fair and Jimmy Wilde. Jimmy Wilde, who one day said to me, Mr. Scarrett was a kind man. He used to get me in the ring, about 20 or 30 fights I used to have on one day. One afternoon, having knocked out 10, Mr. Scarrett said, "Done well, Jimmy," he said, "now come down the caravan byre with me and have a cup of tea and a bun." I went down and a cup of tea and a bun and came back and knocked out 6 more.
The fairground boxing booth run by Scarrett was a tough nursery, not only for Rhondda's champions, but for many a young lad like Reg Edwards, with handy fists and empty pockets.
Scarrett was on the rostrum, shouting odds, and just threw a cap up and we'd accept the boxer of our choice. Usually the boxers that Scarrett took around with him were hard hitters, boys that were capable of stopping their opponents. Very often There were British champions being paraded, but the economic circumstances were so bad that you'd have a go at anybody to earn a pound. It is true that we were hungry, and we were mostly doing it for the money that was in it.
In the 30s, one Rhondda boxer came very near a world title. Tommy Farr of Tonopandi fought his way up to become our best heavyweight between the wars. Here's the victorious end of his first bout with Max Baer. But there were other fights, not for purses, but for principles. In 1935, for example, at the Dare Pit, Kumpark.
There was conflict then about what union the miners should join. And the miners in this pit decided, in order to establish their right to join the union they wanted, their own, they decided to stay down the pit. And 80 men stood down in this pit for 9 days. And eventually they solved the problem by forcing the company to concede all their demands. And they earned the right to join their own union. Now this was a fight not for bread, not for wages, but for a principle. During those 9 days and nights, the men down the pit, of course, had to pass the time away somehow, and they did it by holding concerts, competitions for singing and rhyming and limericks, and of course you had undoubtedly the usual type of Welsh story. On the final day, when they were about to come up the pit, they gathered at pit bottom, and Tommy Lewis Sugar, they called him, a musical conductor in the locality, called the men together and led them in singing the doxology. And people who were gathered at the pit head heard the strains of this music come up the shaft, which was the closing chapter in this epic.
There were few blessings left for Rhondda in those days. In 10 years, 20,000, mostly the young, left their homes and the endless idleness of the street corner and dole queue to find a living elsewhere. And they carried Rhondda into dispersion.
I personally organized 2 deputations to successive prime ministers. And I well remember Mr. Stanley, the Minister of Labour, in 1935, telling the deputation that we should do everything in our power to get the men away from their misery. It was obvious that as far as the government was then concerned, that there was only one task to be done, and that was to take away the men and the young men and the young people from the valley itself. Now that migration became a definite flood. It was a one-way ticket and a one-way traffic. And those young men and young women were never destined to return.
Most of the people of the Rhondda went away from here to Coventry, Birmingham and London, and they've never come back because they are better off there. I had the heartache to see so many going from here. I myself have never gone with all the hardships.
It robbed Rhondda of its most virile, the most promising of its population, leaving Rhondda sadly burdened with a larger percentage than should be of aged population. And so it continues up to this day. It is still affecting the situation here in Rhondda.
The last of Rhondda's vigorous life drained away through the 30s, away from the silent tip and the gaunt and derelict shaft. Many of these pits were closed, never to reopen. The 2 Rhonddas lay inert and helpless and dying. The first faint kiss of economic life came with work in factories outside the valley. In 1936, the Treforest Trading Estate was established, and light industry began to make some inroad into the numbers of workless men. By 1939, 2 factories had been built in Rhondda itself, but until the war began, migration and unemployment continued. September 1939, Once again, war demanded coal, and the aging and almost worn-out pits were galvanized into activity. Dramatically, almost overnight, Rhondda found itself re-employed. Now, hands grown soft in idleness hardened again at the coalface. Into the moribund coalfield came life and purpose and wages. The call-up brought the Bevin boys to the pits to eke out a mining population shrunken by wastage. And after victory came vesting day. The nationalization of the industry in 1947 must have seemed a miner's millennium, a final, lasting triumph. At last, the pits belonged to the people, what was left of them. In Rhondda, area manager Gerald Blackmore talks of the position as the NCB found it in 1947.
There were some 14 working units in the Rhondda Valley itself, employing some 14,000 people, and in the first year of nationalization turned out about 2.5 million saleable tons. And it's interesting to compare what the position is today, because during that period the 14 pits have come down and we now only have 7 pits. And the interesting factor, there are a little under 7,000 men. But despite this lower manpower and the higher rate of absenteeism, we are currently producing some from the 7 collieries 1.5 million tons. So this means that the productivity per worker in this period of 18 years has gone up by some 40%.
Mechanization has produced new ways of working, like the 2-foot 8 seam here at Cambrian. The working face is no higher than a tabletop. Under this low roof, miners used to crouch or lie prone for hours, cutting coal by hand. Now the steel plough rips along the 100-yard face, gouging the coal onto the belt conveyors. The miner at last has adequate tools for his trade. Above ground too, wherever it's economically possible, there's been modernization, with Mardy's new-look pit the best example in Rhondda.
Mechanization is a very wide subject and is not purely confined to coal getting on the face by machine. No doubt you'll remember years ago men used to do an awful lot of hand tramming, but on the modern pit today you will find that at pit tops and pit bottoms trams are moved by mechanical means. Likewise, in the old days, the coal was conveyed from the face to the pit bottom in trams, whereas today there's a growing tendency for either locomotive haulage to be used, but more particularly belt conveyed from the coal face right to the pit bottom where it's loaded. All these are factors of mechanization, in addition to coal face mechanization, where of course the productivity, both in this valley and all over the country, has led the world in terms of new techniques to get coal at the cheapest price and equate against this receding manpower force.
There lies the problem. The pool of labor, skilled and unskilled, that for so long sustained the pits of the valley is drying up. Mechanization can replace manpower, but only up to a certain maximum point.
I believe the conditioner for the future rests in the manpower position. We have had this tremendous rundown in manpower in recent years, and in the end you can't work pits without men. No matter how much you do by way of mechanization at the coalface and elsewhere, you are dependent on men in the bitter end.
In the end, it depends on men like these, on Di and Jim and their comrades still at work in the Rhondda today, the minority that remains of what was once the great majority.
They say that mining is easier today than what it was years ago. It might be easier in regards to the cutting of the coal because you've got punchers, cutters, and all the rest of it to assist you. But still, the tempo have increased. Therefore, it's more tearing. I mean, years ago, I used to go to work. If you could only fill 3 ton of coal, which is what you fit in a coal. If you could fit 10, it was 10. But you was working to your own capability. Today, you're expected to keep up to time. Everything is worked on the clock.
Two Rhondda miners driving home from what is still a major industry in the valley. Gone forever from these streets are the coal-blackened faces, the rough working clothes, and the tramp of nailed boots that marked a shift coming home. Gone too, perhaps, with the old working methods, is the pride of craft, now replaced by the discipline and teamwork of a mechanized coalface. What used to be in hard necessity the hereditary job no longer descends from father to son. There are other jobs, and Rhondda parents have long memories.
One of our biggest problems in juvenile recruitment is from the attitude of parents who recognize the fact that before the war, for 70% of males, it was either a question of working in the mining industry or being on the dole. And whilst it's unfortunate, one must recognize that this is the backcloth under which and against which we must have a recruitment program. I would believe that the vast majority of trade unions today recognize the fact in the Rhondda that they do get a fair deal from the coal industry. And I would say from the recognized leaders, it does not prejudice their attitude to the industry to any marked extent. But as a labor-dense industry, we have to have people. And our recruitment program is certainly prejudiced by the attitude of people who remember the past, which I do not believe, relative to the attitude of the board, since nationalization, is fully justified.
It's in the miners' lodges that local attitudes are still decided. In the past, these were the rallying grounds of defiance. Today, they consult with management. They deal with welfare and cases of compensation. And their vital concern is with the threat of pit closure and the fear of redundancy. Like management, they're well aware of the drift away from the pits and the daily absence, as the area manager claims, of one Rhondda miner in every 4 from his place of work.
The absenteeism has increased since nationalization from about 10% in this community to a current figure of 24. When one asks the reason why, I think this is largely a matter of opinion. By and large, the whole prosperity of the area has risen tremendously during this period. I think a big factor must be the amount of the female population which is currently in employment in Rhondda. And this increases the overall income coming into the house. And therefore, I think this tends to encourage absenteeism to some extent. And one thing that I feel one must comment on, that mining is, to some extent, a more dangerous industry than others, and certainly the higher rate of absenteeism must in the end prejudice the safety of everyone employed underground. People moving from one job to another because of absenteeism must give rise to some lack of safety, which would not take place if people work more regularly.
Recruitment, absenteeism, safety in these pits. After nearly 20 years of nationalized coal, problems like these still have to be resolved in terms of the relations between coal board and coal miners. As union leader Will Whitehead sees it, attitudes have changed. But so too has the industrial and economic background of the collier's life.
In the past, the attitudes were very clearly defined. The enemy was the coal owner. To put it in a nice way, the devil wore a big moustache. It was possible to define him because however much he suffered, we who were employed by him suffered more. And so there was no doubt about what we had to do. We had to oppose him and try to win from him greater wages, more reforms, etc., etc. But today, you see, the enemy, if he is to be the employer, is the National Coal Board. And we, the miners, fought for nationalisation. And we must defend nationalisation. So the lines are not clearly drawn at all. And however much nationalisation has given us, and it has given us much, the 5-day week, the rest days, it has started on fringe benefits, given us better holidays, however much it has done, the mining industry still has to compete commercially in this country. And as a consequence, because it has to do that, it still hasn't got the money to give us the other reforms which we require. And so, rather than strike, as they did in the old days, when there was no other industry about, men are choosing to leave the mining industry and go to work in much more congenial conditions in factories, mills, workshops, and what have you. So you see, there is this marked difference today. The militancy is there, but they're not called upon to use it because our alternative means of employment are available to them.
For many former miners, alternative employment means commuting to work elsewhere. Nearly half the men of the Porth and Penagraig district, for example, now work outside the valley. In Rhondda itself, 23 factories have been built since the war to provide a variety of work for women as well as men. In a clothing factory like this, special shift times have been arranged to suit working mothers. The emancipation of smaller families and the new equality of the female wage packet means the women are better off.
Oh, a lot better off. Everybody is better off. The Rhondda is better off. The factories have come here for the women to work and to earn money. The work is so much easier than in my time. And everybody is renovating up their homes and much more independent.
Today, the valley's face is changing from old chaos to new order. The drab Victorian sprawl is disappearing under a modern pattern of industry. And the character of the townships and villages that thread the long street is changing too. Villages like Cumpark, for example, where Yori Thomas lives.
Yes, I think that this village of Cumpark is a kind of a microcosm that reflects the changes that have taken place throughout the Rhondda as a whole. Now, take this pit here, dead. It's just scrap iron and junk. There were 3 pits there in this village, but only one is left now. And you can see this decline of the village reflected in its institutions.
The social life that was rooted in nonconformist faith, the societies based on the chapels, the big choirs, the drama groups, the meetings, sacred and secular, all have broken down into a new and looser social pattern.
There's a kind of a fragmentation. People are leaving the village, especially the young men and women. And that is the tragedy, that the young breeders, the fertile groups are going, and all that's left behind are the old hens.
Up and down both valleys, the workmen's institutes were once the keystones of a self-made and radical society. Today, they must survive on the profits of the bar and the one-armed bandit. Today, the rooms where workless men in the 30s read everything from Hansard to the Christian Herald are storage space for beer glasses and bingo cards. And in the library, the cupboards are closed. Now, no hand pulls down a book in strong support of argument. The dust gathers on those articles of faith as it seems to have gathered on what was once the ardent radicalism of Rhondda.
There are those who have held that the intense radicalism of the Rhondda belongs to the days of the have-nots, and that the socialism which was practiced in those days had its roots in Methodism. I believe that both went together. Men were both religious and socialists at the same time. Today, there are people who wonder whether they've got either their socialism or their religion.
And along the streets of Rhondda stand the chapels, islands isolated now in a sea of materialism.
They're there. They're like empty shells. In fact, they dot the landscape of this valley like extinct volcanoes. These large, barrack-looking, austere buildings are empty. And there you have the transformation that has taken place.
Yr arglwydd sydd yn gwneithio'r cyfiawnder a barn i'r rhai gorthrymedig oll. Ysbys oedd ei ffyrdd I Foses, a'i weithred oedd I feibion Israel. Trigarog a graslon yw yr arglwydd, hwyr frydig I lyd a mawr o drigarogrwydd. It is true that they are no longer volcanic, but I do not think that they are in any way becoming extinct. If the valley is to survive in any cultural, political and religious sense, there surely must be a burning again of the old volcanoes.
With dwindling attendance and an aging membership, the chapels that could between them seat Rhondda's entire population now echo no more with a packed chorus of praise and worship. Some are shut, some sold to very different use. But some, like Nazareth at Pennegraig, have been rebuilt to a social purpose.
I like actually the situation of one or two churches that have been sold to the Rhondda Council, where the development is a communal development, where chapels are used for definitely new ways, a new means of expression. And I think that the churches failed to realize that a part of its message was to enter more fully into the community.
Those churches that have been changed, say, to voluntary centres or old people centres, whatever they are, community centres, they have been organised with a body that has capital. They can use money to that purpose.
Nothing from Rhondda's social and cultural history has survived more strongly than the urge to be educated and to educate others.
This was formerly a colliery site, derelict for many years afterwards, and the people have been inclined to look at this place as if it's abandoned, something like the valley itself. But no, what has happened is that on this old, disused site, a miracle has taken place. An imaginative modern school to meet the needs of the modern child. This school has arisen so that the children can have all kinds of education to suit not only what the Rhondda needs, but what the world at large is looking for. We are trying in the school to get parents to think that there are opportunities not only in the valley but outside. They know that apprenticeships of varying kinds are awaiting their children just outside the valley. That's going to break down the idea that the Rhondda's parochial and that we are inbreeding. We hope that this school is an attempt to grow up educationally as well as reach out to the modern world.
Much of Rhondda's schooling is still housed in the old formal style, but well over a third of these children go on from junior school to grammar school, urged on by parents and by long tradition.
Rhondda people felt that education was a kind of ladder which allowed them to climb out of the pit. Unfortunately, at this time, the educational system was largely self-generating. The products of the system led back into education and nowhere else. So that Rhondda produced teachers. There was little opportunity for anything else. Now, however, industry, the professions, government service woo the sixth former with attractions which teaching cannot equal. The pull is now from a broad front.
In the language laboratory of a Rhondda grammar school, these youngsters are a long way from the darkness and danger their forefathers knew at the same age. Today, they are heirs to a new and much more equal society.
I have 500 boys in the school. Their parents come from all walks of life. The boys themselves are not conscious of differences in wealth, differences in social position. They are conscious only of differences in ability, differences in capacity for work, and excellence in games.
And sixth form Rhondda is conscious too of the need to argue and to look critically at its formative background of valley life.
The basic snag of existence here is the fact that we are all still under the rather vicious thumb of the Puritan nonconformity of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. We are still held by reactionary forces.
Yeah, I don't think this has any real effect on us today. I know there's no effect, very little effect on me. I don't think it's going to have
the damage which this growing up under these stifling influences has already been done. I should say we'll all go from here, and whether we like it or not, we are going to have a Puritan background, whether we like it or not. We've got it ground into us.
I think this conformity, this great sense of conformity, is a snag in a way. You take it now, well, since the time of the Depression anyway, the Rhonddas returned to Parliament at each election a socialist candidate with an overwhelming majority, even though the Rhondda tends to be conservative. Well, what I mean, we can only, conservative in outlook, not conservative in politics, yes. We can only attribute this to this sense of conformity, this sort of follow the herd idea.
And it doesn't matter who the Labour Party puts up for election, they can stick a Dalek there for all that. But he'll get the Parliament.
But this conformity, this single way of life in a mining valley, is breaking down into diversity. To Ron Berry, it will die as memory dies of the sour industrial past.
Oh, I'm sure the fag end of racial memory exists now, you know, in probably in the council chambers and in pubs, in clubs, among people of my generation and a little older. Perhaps it's a nasty taste in a lot of people's mouths, probably, but I'm sure it'll die, I'm sure it'll fade away, as the history of the Rhondda itself is fading away, you know. Which isn't to say that these things, when they occurred, weren't vital, because the Rhondda obviously gave a social impetus and gave social values to industry throughout the whole world, probably.
These valleys and the life in these streets have inspired many writers, but few artists. One of them, Ernest Zabole, has come back to his native valley to live and to paint. As he says, coming back here was like climbing back into a warm bed.
Briefly, it's the place which interests me rather than the people. But then that's not quite right, because you can't help thinking of people, the people who inhabit Rhondda streets, when you look at these streets. Well, this is one painting that I've made, which has been influenced by the Rhondda. Although I've been interested in form again in doing this thing. And in the painting here, there is the horizon at the top and bottom, with the center of the valley, as it were, down through the middle. Towards the center, there is a street with a person, and there are windows through which you can see people, some in bed, some just looking out. And the whole thing, I hope, is something woven which gives you an idea of the valley.
Right, gentlemen from the middle section after the chord of F minor.
Even the traditional repertoire of the male choirs is breaking with past conformity. Pendiris, one of Rhondda's two big choirs, rehearses in a schoolroom under Glyn Jones and exults in Latin in a mass by Perosi.
Right, again watching the endings and giving me good clear tones. Right, Brian, when you're ready.
gentlemen, please. The boy with the voice for the future. Mr. Desmond Reese. Thank you.
Saw me crying in the chapel. The tears I shed were tears of joy.
The new affluence, which is now a characteristic of the valley, is developing its own institution and making the clubs a place of grandeur and likewise a place where they can turn in, they can sit down, they can talk, they can speak, they can sing. All their interests actually are being provided for them. Here is a tremendous change. The club today as a center of the communal life and the church as it were perishing on the circumference.
Legs 11. Walking sticks 77, 8 and 3 83, bed and breakfast 2 and 6, 7 and 1 71, 3 and 2 32, key of the door 21.
Across the new pattern of Rhondda life, the old pattern of death strikes savagely and suddenly. Along the silent streets, the dead miners of Cambrian are escorted to their long home, and Rhondda watches in shocked anger that it could have happened again in 1965. One by one, the latticed memorials of past labour are stripped and felled. In 1913, there were 53 pits in Rhondda. Today, there are 6, and an economic question mark hangs over each of them. In the days when pit wheels turned, or failed to turn, at the end of every street, there was often little to buy in the shops, and often nothing to buy it with. Today, shop windows match the shopping purse, and the cafes share this affluence. Instead of pop and pies and politics, there are menus now of distinction. In Rhondda, there's money to spare for most of the pleasures. Housing is still a major concern for the borough. The long lines of aging houses, though painted and refurbished with pride, are too small for easy conversion. New flats and new council estates are building, high on the hilltops above the valley, in a cleaner air perhaps, but a cooler social climate than that of the terraces along the river. The Civic Trust has proposed a new centre for Rhondda, where the two valleys meet at Porth, and says the next generation must have an environment to match the dramatic change from the past. But to a generation like Will Mainwaring's, much of the future lies elsewhere.
From the mining angle, there is no future in the sense that we knew Rhondda. The question of suitable employment is one that can only be decided outside of Rhondda itself. Call it a dormitory town, if you like. But there must be suitable employment provided within easy traveling distance. And in that way, Rhondda can have a long history.
At the mouth of the last private level in Rhondda, we are looking back into history. This is how it all began. When and how will it end? Despite pit closures and the threat of more closures to come, this is the future as Gerald Blackmore sees it.
I believe the future of the valley is not suspect in terms of the market for coal. South Wales is particularly fortunate in the very high grades of coal, which were laid down many, many millions of years ago, and therefore I believe they will always be in demand. As far as Rhondda is concerned, we are rich in coal for many, many decades to come, if we have the manpower to work it.
These are independent miners, 5 men who work this level as a private venture. They admit they're making a good living out of it, but even they are pessimistic about the future of coal in Rhondda.
Well, I'll give you my opinion. Mining came into this valley the way we're mining it by, and I think that's the way it's going to go out. Come in levels, and it's going to finish with the level end. I think this will be the last in the valley. I don't think the valley itself has got long to go. I wish it had a good future, but I think the coal owners took the best of it. It's gone.
Perhaps, as these men claim, we're near the twilight end of the Rhondda miners' day. But for the long street that is Rhondda, surely it's only the end of the beginning. Perhaps Will Whitehead speaks for most of Rhondda when he says,
"My view, for what it's worth, is that there will be limited employment in the Rhondda, limited population, a much more beautiful place to live in, and much the same in terms of debate and argument as went on before."